In terms of public governance forms for sustainable food, starting with the state and then branching out, for convenience I've put it into 4 broad areas. First of all, there's state direction, directly from the state through regulation and payment supports. The best example of this are the recent Common Agricultural Policy reforms, where payment is given for environmental stewardship. So there's a form of sustainable agriculture or sustainability of food production being developed on farm and processing levels, and this is sponsored by the EU through the Common Agricultural Policy but filtered through the national states. This is linked to cross-compliance as well. They have to comply to get the funding, farmers, with observing a range of existing EU regulations or UK law as a result around animal welfare, environmental stewardship and so on, and food safety. Also, going back to the global level, we have to meet our international obligations, and here a key one that looms over the activity that's been taking place in the UK are the climate change agreements, Kyoto Protocol, and this feeds through in all sorts of ways, as hopefully you'll pick up as I give some examples. But this is about reducing energy use and measuring it in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The other ways in which the UK provides a framework, I think, leads again to these private sector actions. First are strategies. The Sustainable Farming and Food Strategy of 2002 is the first one that particularly looked at food within the UK sustainability context, sustainable policy context. We have the Food Industry Supply Chain Strategy, FIS, which I'll tell you some work on and come back and talk about. Food Matters and the Food 2030 vision and its implementation, which the current government have sort of left behind, I think, but it came under Gordon Brown's government. I was a member of the advisory board for the Food Matters report from the Cabinet Office, so I've got some insights into that. Research and technology promotion, the Cross Research Council's Food Security Initiative is an example of this. And advisory, that is, providing strategies which try and get us to behave more sustainably in our consumption, choice and activity. And we also have then, falling out of this, state-led voluntary agreements. And I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at these, but 2 which I'm not going to look at, but you could say are sustainably related, but certainly they're very important for food policy, are around improving consumption of foods that are less harmful to your health. And one thing they've done is food product reformulation, the manufacturers and retailers in liaison with the Food Standards Agency. That responsibility is now passed to the Department of Health. And nutrient-based food labelling, which goes beyond the 2011 EU Food Information Regulation, which was passed finally last year. That nutrient-based food labelling is a traffic light labelling. You might have seen that Tesco's, recently agreed to join in on that. So it's a voluntary approach led by the state, and that's been haggled over since 2005. The original prototype came from Oxford University, from Mike Rayner and his colleagues. Anybody here working with Mike? Is he here today? Okay. Well, and I know Mike quite well from other areas, which I'll talk about later. So you've had a important work later. Okay. So moving into the main themes then that I put at the beginning, private-public governance interface. And these are some of the themes I think that come out, which I've already hinted at. The first thing is you get state promotion. The enabling state is the way that Labour used to talk about it when they were in government. And it's the state trying to promote the right activity in different sectors. Here we're looking at the agri-food sectors. Also, we see the state monitoring and rewarding private initiatives and pursuits, and this can lead to a form of co-regulation. I'll illustrate that shortly. What very important in this is the role of delegated state bodies or delegated governance. There's a myriad of quasi-governmental bodies, some of which evolve into freestanding corporates, bodies, but still play the role of delivering strategies on behalf of the state and promoting that delivery. The strategies tend to be existing structures brought together and setting out new guidelines or outcomes they want to achieve. These are through voluntary agreements. And what you're seeing in the sustainability world is a sort of increasing move towards non-competitive agreements on what they should do. as opposed to competitive advantage from doing things. But they both coexist. And this boundary between competitive and non-competitive is something I'm particularly interested in at the moment. I'm trying to think through. Overall, the UK food policy over the last decade, at least, has fit into what we might call, those of you familiar with ecological modernisation as a concept, it fits very much into that. This is an example of the emergence of the state and the private certification scheme, the coexistence. And the non-competitive elements are most visible in food safety. Food safety for manufacturers, retailers and the like is the bottom line. You can't have a business without saying that you guarantee food safety. Even if you can't guarantee it, you go to great lengths to make your customers think or hope that they believe in it. And one of the areas in where we had a great degree of convergence amongst producers in the UK was over the development of assurance schemes, which would assure that the food coming from the farm would be regarded as safe. And these sprung up in the late 1990s. Now in 2000 there was a food crisis period which rolled on for some time. It had been there before. Blair's a relatively new Prime Minister called a summit in Downing Street, and one of the things they came out with, because the NFU went up and said, look, we've got a great idea, we've got these assurance schemes that have been set up by our producers, cereal growers, potato growers, pig producers, all the rest of it. Why don't we have some sort of national standard which the government comes out and supports? So he walks out of Downing Street waving the assured, well, it was British Food Standards it was called at the time. And this was under Nick Brown, who was Minister of Agriculture at the time. It was then the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. On this was a red tractor, which evolved into this logo, covered all the main farm insurance schemes. So by 2005, 76,000 growers and producers. Most of the main commodities that we produce in this country are covered under this. But what has happened during this intervening period between 2000 and about 2007, 2008, was that a range of different government agencies, commissions and so forth reviewed it and said, okay, what do we think of it? Number 10 was involved initially. The Curry Commission, which was set up, which was to look at the future of food and farming, which was set up as the final crisis of the next crisis rather, of the foot and mouth disease outbreak, gave impetus to do a policy review. DEFRA, which replaced MAF as the responsible government department, reviewed it. The Food Standards Agency reviewed it, and actually the Sustainable Development Commission, watchdog for government on sustainability issues, set up by Labour, looked at it as well, and they suggested that it needed a green trailer. So you have a red tractor with a green trailer because there wasn't enough environmental standards in it. And actually, if you look at it, it's primarily a food safety device, the Assured Food Standards Scheme, but there are some elements of sustainability and environment, secondary elements, which are attached. The Curry Commission saw it being as a guarantee of baseline standards in the UK, but also said it should be owned by the whole food chain, so no longer being the domain of the producers, who have traditionally been the strongest element in food policy in previous decades. This was one of the things which shows us that actually the retailers and manufacturers are now the bigger players. It was then relaunched with a whole food chain emphasis. The British Retail Consortium became a member of the board. Food and Drink Federation, I'll keep going back to these peak associations, DEFRA were observers. And then, as they had to introduce the EU food hygiene regulation in 2006, the first food safety that went back onto the farm, they looked at the red tractor standard and said, well, perhaps we could use this as a way of lightening the regulatory load because it's already in place. So they co-opted this private governance scheme, which had been highly scrutinised by different government agencies and bodies, and they introduced it as the means by which you could get a lighter touch on local authority inspections of farm under the food hygiene regulation. So if you're a member of the Red Tractor scheme, only 2% of schemes get investigated by auditors rather than 25%, because it's done by the Red Tractor people. And this is a good example of co-regulation taking place. The state co-regulating alongside the established, more private setting. Moving on to sustainability more directly, one of the things that came out of Curry and emerged subsequent to that was the need to reduce carbon and waste in the food industry itself. So that's moving off the farm now into processing, manufacturing and retail. And the food industry sustainability strategy was set up in 2006. And we've looked at this in some depth and done quite a lot of detailed interviews, including with ministers involved in this. And this is just a quick synopsis of what's come out of that work, which I'm writing up at the moment, actually. So one is it's a collation of existing work. Strategies pull together what's already there because, you know, you can't start from scratch. So you look at what's around and you re-govern it you re-mold it into a strategy. What is very clear is DEFRA played a key agency role in making this work. That actually there was one civil servant involved who had responsibility, and he was seen as very key to actually getting the strategy in place and making the component parts to take it forward work. So there's a key role in agency which comes through in this work, which should not be forgotten. And it's interesting in this case that the person involved was actually seconded to work for the FDF for a year or so as well, while still at DEFRA. So there's a very close relationship there between private and public. This led to industry-led champions groups in different areas of sustainability, waste, etc. And these were negotiated outcomes as to what they would deliver. So, you know, it's not saying this is what should be sustainable, it's what can we deliver that can look sustainable. So it's the moulding of our targets around sustainability. Delegated governance bodies played a key role. RAP, the Waste Resources Action Programme, people familiar with RAP? Anybody been doing work on that? They're based up at Banbury, actually, not far away. They have been a key agent in delivering some of these strategic goals, working with industry. And they continue to be. They've survived. There was another one called EnviroWise, which ended up being moulded up with RAP. The Carbon Trust is another one that was involved, which is involved in energy more generally. And really what you're doing is setting paths of future action. And the Labour Minister involved talked to us about this, and he said this was very much conceptualised around what they called environmental modernisation, which actually is the same as ecological modernisation for those who use it academically, but it was the way they translated it through Labour policy documents. The Fabian Society. After FIS, we then get a run of different, basically industry-driven governance schemes to try and improve the sustainability of different aspects of industry's food activity. First of these is a quartile commitment, which has gone through two phases. Firstly, mainly it looks at waste, but increasingly they've been finding ways to count the carbon reduction from the reduction of waste. And waste is food waste and packaging, essentially. And there the carbon counting has become a very important thing. So that relates back, I think, to the Kyoto Protocol. We can see that sort of shadow shining very much across what's being done. This gave in turn to the Federation House commitment, which was brokered by RAP, it provides a secretariat, and the Food and Drink Federation. This was actually the retail industry, quartiled. FDF with RAP sort of in the driving seat, and HUDR is the Welsh Water Authority, which you might be familiar with, but they actually carried out the work with RAP providing the secretariat. So this money tends to get funded with seed funding from DEFRA, and then industry putting in resources as well. Another one is the Retail Innovation Programme, which spun off the quartile commitment with retail. This was DEFRA funded, with RAP providing the secretariat again. And this has just been relaunched earlier this year as a product sustainability forum. So we moved from innovation to sustainability. So you can see this sort of non-competitive element is now focusing much more on sustainability, which means there's a growing agreement and consensus around some steps that need to be taken. This is funded by DEFRA and the Scottish and Welsh governments. RAP again is the secretariat, and it also includes the home improvement sector, which are the big sheds, you know, B&Q and all the rest of it, the DIY places. Another example is the dairy industry sustainability example. Here, the delegated state, again, this came out of the Curry Commission. How do we improve the environmental aspects of food and farming? Starts there, DEFRA are the chair. They set up a dairy supply chain forum, bringing in the producers and, of course, importantly, the processors and retailers. This leads to a dairy supply chain sustainable consumption and production task force. Sustainable consumption and production is a term which really gained policy leverage after 2002 at the Johannesburg Rio Plus 10, and it's still very much at the forefront, although it's slowly being edged out by resource efficiency. That's something to look out for if you haven't noticed that already. This is chaired by DairyCo. DairyCo is part of the Agricultural, Horticulture and Development Boards, which is a government and industry-funded research promotion board, what we call the levy boards. There's a levy taken from all producers to share this research. So this moves into, again, this sort of shared non-competitive arena. It's another example of delegated governance body. This leads to a milk roadmap with goals set, particularly around things like carbon reduction, improving animal welfare and so forth. This gets expanded to include the rest of the dairy sector, and cheese and etc. And in particular, they refine their carbon footprinting measures, echo Kyoto again, to the dairy roadmap. And then the dairy industry itself spins off this and sets up its own 2020 vision, which was published a couple of months ago. It's a vision and framework, economic, environment and social, Forum for the Future, which is a sort of consultancy, are enabling this. This, of course, relates to the fact that the dairy industry is in some crisis at the moment, certainly the producers are, and so the economic aspects are coming much more to the fore in this sustainability discussion now than it was previously, where it was more about carbon reduction and so forth. But at the same time, a lot of how this is going to be enabled comes through the major industries in the food sector. And so we have in existence, or set up during this period, retailers, producers groups. These are the supermarkets with their suppliers setting up groups in which to disseminate good practice, better standards, more traceability, and so forth. One that we looked at for an earlier project, which I haven't mentioned here, called On Ethical Traceability, was the British Flour Development Group, which came to an agreement over quality standards amongst the wheat suppliers. When we did interviews on this about 8 years ago, it was a while back anyway, we talked to wheat growers and said, well, it'd be great to say that that bread came from flour from the wheat on my farm, but that's never going to happen because it's a combinable crop, it's so big. And all of a sudden, Sainsbury's come up with a scheme to say that in their own bakeries, they've got bread where they can trace it back to the individual grower, predominantly in East Anglia. So actually that came through the setting up of Sainsbury's British Flour Development Group. In terms of dairy, Sainsbury's have a dairy development group. In 2007, they had 334 milk producers involved in that. It's about efficiencies and innovation, but within that efficiency falls environment and energy. So actually sustainability is about business wins. It's being framed in that way, in particular reduction in energy. But there are other aspects as well. ASDA set up a dairy link producers best practice groups. Tesco has a sustainable dairy project, which has one environmental stream. Again, it's about efficiencies as well. Here, of course, what you've got is very private governance. So you've got a sort of public rollout with private industry, but you've got very segmented competitive elements feeding into the non-competitive environment, very competitive elements here taking place. So on animal welfare, for example, I've seen veterinary officials complain that they can't get hold of the details on things like mastitis from these producer groups' work. So there's a sort of privatization of some of the knowledge which could be better spread out. All of this led to a strategy then, which from the Food Matters report, the last government came out with a Food 2030 vision, how we get there. You can't see this, unfortunately, but this is the summary document, not the actual detailed document. But what's interesting about this is they get sign-off from the main trade associations in the food supply chain. So this is the British Retail Consortium, the supermarkets. Here we have the Food and Drink Federation of Manufacturers, and here the National Farmers Union, the farmers. So there's three main. The food service industry, the restaurants aren't as well organised. They have got a peak organisation, but it's not very representative. But these three are seen as key players. So they, again, it's this sort of non-competitive, but they are needed to roll out what's in here because most of it is voluntary agreements and arrangements. To back this up, the state have also come up with Sustainable Food System Indicators, which they drew up in 2010. Now just to let you know, this is probably a cul-de-sac, both of these, because this was very associated with Brown, and there was opposition in DEFRA to it anyway, the 2030 vision. And now ministers, or at least the last minister, Jim Pace, talked glowingly about the 2050 Foresight report, which of course, Oxford played a big role in. The fact that one is 2050 and the other is 2030 has something to do with it. But there's been a transfer, and the fact of the political origins. However, there are still available, although don't know yet, these are being monitored still, or being followed up, and I've got a couple of PhD students looking into this. Food system indicators, and they reflected the priorities in the 2030 vision. So about a better diet, more resilient, profitable food system, and they found indicators from evidence they've already got, some of which still need developing in this document. They say to be developed, but so it's things of a resilience. Partly one of the things is food safety outbreaks. So if there are fewer food safety outbreaks, it's seen as being a more resilient food system in the UK. And you can see greenhouse gas. But these, obviously, we're seeing sustainability issues coming in. So what the state's doing here is it's trying to find ways in which it can define and monitor and audit alongside its existing activities, a set of indicators to measure improvement on this journey to sustainability. And this reflects back, I think, very much to Michael Power's work on the Audit Society in the 1990s. This is a quote from Michael Power, which I think we use in our textbook on food policy. But basically it says, as the state has become committed to an indirect supervisory role, audit has become a decisive function, like the sustainability indicators. The state can't play this indirect role without assuming the efficacy of these practices at the foot of the regulatory hierarchy. Audit makes possible ways of redesigning the problem of government. And for me, that's very much what governance is about. It's about how we're reframing and redesigning these things. So that takes us to the third area, and this is actually more the signalling of sustainable food part, and draws on the work that we did on transparent food in the last couple of years, or some of the work we did. We did a lot more, actually. We had a very detailed look at certification schemes, but I haven't really written this into this. But I go back to Michael Redcliffe in a paper he wrote published in 2001, where he was using Latour and saying that choices are expressed through market preferences. And he was looking at environmental labels and schemes. And in policy, such choices have material effects, i.e. what we see as sustainability is how it's designed by these kinds of operations. And to that extent, I would say that certification schemes and standards translate environmental, ethical and social concerns into management and verification audit systems. And I think that's not, loads of people write about that, so that's not my original thinking. But that's what I see as taking place, and I agree. And of course, there have been a lot of critiques about the impacts of these certification schemes. Catherine has written about this, and others. These are just some examples that I thought of as I was writing that sentence. But they're all, excellent pieces of work. So what we get is the governance and politics around what are the boundaries of these schemes. How do we certify them? What are the thresholds for what's good and bad? What are the methodologies? So for example, there's a scheme for the supply chain called Global Gap, which is a good agricultural practice. And there are ethical and social elements in that. But Global Gap has a range of distinctions about major musts and minor musts. So basically, the minor ones you don't have to do in order to get the certification. And the social and ethical stuff is there. It's not in the major. So although they're trying to expand, they're experimenting with these things, there are very clear boundaries drawn. If we look at setting food standards that are translated or moved into these certification schemes, we can see a sort of dynamic where the state has some role, but very much the corporate sector and civil society. So actually what we get as our certification schemes, what we see as sustainable food now, may actually be the result of good old-fashioned political lobbying and entrepreneurship by civil society organisations. I'll give you some examples of that. These are 4 that you're probably familiar with, or at least you'll be familiar with 3 of them, I would think. Fairtrade, well, that came out of civil society organisations. Many people who are sympathetic to Fairtrade critique it. There's a sort of support a critique of Fairtrade, which is really, I think Catherine's work comes into that. Freedom Food is animal welfare, set up by the RSPCA. But the point about these is, at least with the exception of Fairtrade possibly, but Fairtrade needs industry as well, certainly these other ones have had to work with industry. So civil society has pressed for them, industry has responded. In the Marine Stewardship Council, you'll be familiar with that for sustainable fisheries, but actually that was an initiative where Unilever went to the NGO, in this case WWF, which had played a role in setting up in the first place, and said we need some sort of scheme, and they looked at the Marine Conservation Society standards for fisheries, which are 2 men and a dog working there, so the actual scientific basis of this is pretty thin, or pretty it is thin. I mean, it's enlightened but thin. Ethical Trading Initiative, as I've had it explained to me, this is actually an internal one, really, for along the supply chain for particularly retailers. Covers more than just food, but that basically came about by the unions pressing the cooperative society through the cooperative society linked to the unions, and they sat down in Manchester and tried to hammer out some sort of code which became the Ethical Trading Initiative, who are based just a few hundred yards from where we actually exist at City University. This sums it up to me. This is Sustain. I don't know if you've heard of Sustain, the Alliance for Better Food and Farming. I'll make my confession now, I'm on the board of Sustain. I've been for some years, been involved in a lot of their projects around public procurement of sustainable food. This is the principles of sustainable food that are given to Sustain, being a consumer end organisation, an alliance of over 100 different groups. This is the advice given to people purchasing food, both businesses and consumers. So there are 7 principles. I won't go through them all, but I've just highlighted the fact that we're relying on existing certification schemes for our principles. To me, that captures the fact that where we are in our journey is what's being put out into the marketplace. It's how it's been translated into market terms. There are 1 or 2 that are not. There's stuff about, promote healthy, well-being, cooking generous portions of vegetable fruit, etc. But nonetheless, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 there, which are all reliant on some form of standard certification. Does that make any difference with the consumers? Well, I haven't done any research on this. The stuff we did for Transparent Food looked at the supply chain. Somebody else was supposed to do the consumers. They didn't really do it, but that's another issue. But this is a survey which conducted, and given that the UK is seen as the more mature of the markets in terms of ethical, social, environmental standards and awareness of labels and logos, this is interesting. This has prompted awareness. So the question was, before today, which, if any, of the following food labelling schemes had you heard of? Fairtrade came up pretty high. Leaf, which is actually, has anybody heard of Leaf, Linking Environment and Farming? I'm talking at their 25th annual conference, the 20th annual conference something next week. I'm a great fan of Leaf, but only 3%. I mentioned that to the technical director at the meeting about a week after this came out. He said, well, that's pretty good. 3%, that's quite a big market share. So, your glass is half full or half empty. But actually, something like Leaf, the truth is, it's about getting the right. It's setting standards for producers, environmental standards on farm, but it's got buy-in from retailers, notably Waitrose and M&S, Marks and Spencer's. So the important thing about Leaf is that it works in the supply chain, and as long as it's got the endorsement of the retailers as the right thing to do, then the recognition of the logo isn't the end goal. It's actually about getting the right behaviour back along. So in a sense, it's both outward facing towards the consumer and backward facing along the supply chain. Anyway, even the red tractor, which you put in more, 20%. And that's, I think they interviewed about 600 odd shoppers in areas around London. This takes me then to the question of sustainable consumption and this market translation. This is a report that was done in 2006, I Will If You Will, towards sustainable consumption by the Sustainable Consumption Roundtable, which was set up. It involved the National Consumer Council, really the driving body in it, plus some other bodies. And they use the term choice editing, which is being used increasingly now. And that means that pre-selecting a range of products and services available to consumers is done all the time. We know that what's on the shelves is chosen by the people who are selling it and the people who are making it. They decide which products and services to offer and what specification. Governments offer it when they set standards. Choice editing happens every day, though currently it says here sustainability is not a significant factor. So in 2006, that view at least suggested that the journey hadn't gained that much momentum. If we look at this. I've actually got a better quote somewhere, but I couldn't find it in time, by the same guy. This is Andrew Pike, who's the Sustainable and Competitiveness Director of the Food and Drink Federation. This was a quote he used in a magazine article a few months ago. Today you won't find a label on food saying this is botulism free. People accept that, so that's the bottom line about food safety. In a few years' time, you shouldn't have to be told that this produce has used water sustainably or dolphin friendly, because it shouldn't be on the shelves unless it is. It's a long journey, the metaphor's still there, but that's where we're heading to. So here's the Food and Drink Federation, the manufacturers, the big manufacturers saying, and representing SMEs as well, saying, you know, they agree with choice editing, basically. He actually does explicitly say that. Okay, so just to reinforce this growth of awareness amongst industry in the UK, I'm just going to give a couple of quotes. This was the work we did then. This was funded by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation Charitable Trust. These are interviews carried out 2007, 2008 around sustainability in UK food security. And these are just some quotes published in other things we've written, but this is about resilience of food supply from the national food retailers. And there's a sense here that the global food supply chain, you know, you source from everywhere in the world. But as a retailer, we could shift very quickly between countries if there was a problem, so we can move from one to the other. There is now recognition that the ability to hop between countries is being constrained as climate change and other issues such as the price of oil kick in. There's a growing awareness in the food industry that things aren't going to be the same in the future. I actually quoted an example of trying to source raspberries in February from 3 different places in the world, and they all were all hit by hailstones and flooding and all the rest of it. So there's an awareness of that. This is a global food manufacturer. If I'm absolutely honest, I have to say I don't know how fragile the whole system is really. I suspect no one does. There's awareness about the need for sustainability, however we define it. Another one here from a National Food Service balance, so 3 different sectors of the industry, 3 main sectors. We're on a cusp of quite a shift in food and what we have seen the past year in terms of increased prices and most tangible change. We're shifting to where we have to be more focused on sustainable supply in the most broad definition. But I think supply and demand will prevail. As the price of products goes up, demand will fall. But that may not help us as a business, of course. Okay, so this rolls into then the Transparent Food Study, where we were looking at various things. But as part of Transparent Food, one of the work packages which we were involved in, we wanted to look at information that relates to environmental and ethical social impacts. And the term used for this was food integrity in the project. So food safety, food quality, and the third area was food integrity. And integrity means these definitely sustainability orientated issues. And to look at, you know, it's a research project, what are the deficiencies and research needs in order to allow the food chain to transmit information towards consumers and policy. So our look was at what was going on in the supply chain. Others looked at other areas around quality and safety. And we were also part of a group which looked at the certification schemes themselves in terms of food integrity and how they defined things, and included animal welfare, veterinary experts and so forth were involved in this work. But going back to this is about signaling the information. What do the supply, this actually came from a very simple question I had, which is, what do the supply chain think is effective? What do they think is working? You know, Fairtrade, all this. What is it that they think is working and why? So signals, we mean messages, abbreviations of information. It's about how information is managed, how a message is sent. As I say, there were 3 dimensions. We looked at food integrity. These are some of the stakeholder perspectives. Straightforward ones, things we know all about. Limited space available on a food product, it's a problem. People come in, they choose their food just like that. You know, they're loading their baskets, they've got their list. Diversity of consumers and information needs, how to balance the right to know with the wish to know from consumers. Key challenges, to summarize, they said to communicate our food safety, origin of food, environmental impacts and sustainability and animal welfare. And the reasons are because it's complexity, particularly on the methodological approaches to sustainability. How do you define it? How do you measure it? some stakeholders saw legislation measures in these areas were not robust or were not selective. Animal origin was very important there, although this has been addressed somewhat in the 2011 EU Food Information Regulation since. Animal welfare is a problem, because animal welfare, animal welfare schemes, when we looked at animal welfare, actually some people in Denmark, specialist animal welfare looked at it, well they made the point that you might say that it's a good animal welfare if the chicken or the pig has got a certain amount of space. But do you actually go and inspect that chicken and pig on regular intervals to see what its health levels are, see if it's free from disease, so on and so forth, what its weight is? And actually you don't. They rely on very, you have to pick your indicators. And that to me is part of the governance of what's happening. What's this one say? This is quite detailed, isn't it? Well, what they said about certification schemes was certification schemes enable retailers and NGOs to meet their own agendas and aims. And that having an audit system with a certification scheme around animal welfare or whatever enables confidence within us that producers within our system are complying with the standard. That's the manufacturer speaking. They can foster cooperation and harmonization. So, for example, the retailers, manufacturers, and the hospitality trade got together on country of origin rules for meat, because there's all this thing about buying British bacon, which has actually been produced in Denmark and then just been cured in the UK. And this is now actually part of the 2011 regulation, but they did that non-competitively at the government's sponsorship. But competition still continues. That actually, even within that, this is a grocery retailer saying, actually, if Sainsbury's and Tesco carry the Fairtrade label too, because it gives consumers a reference point, that's good. More people know about Fairtrade. We just want to say that we do it better. So all our coffee and tea is Fairtrade, and that other supermarket might be 10%. So because it is Fairtrade, you have a reference point between their 10% and your 100%. You probably know what that is, actually. Follow that. Third-party independent certification schemes are critical in ensuring the validity and credibility of the information signaled to consumers for those who use them. What you have to then do, though, is select which ones are the most credible. So you get a selection of which are the favoured ones. 5 or 6 labels out there have the ability to transcend the noise and get through to the consumer, according to that manufacturer. So what you've got is a piecemeal approach of sustainable practices, I would say. I tend to call it a sort of jigsaw with lots of pieces missing. There are some pieces which have been agreed on, and they're there, and they're being translated into the marketplace. But that's what we've got for sustainable food, just like the sustains list. According to one holder, certification scheme owner, stakeholder making commitments on one commodity will create the need for retailers and manufacturers to look at other commodities as well. So again, it's a journey on a destination. Communication can be along the food chain about best practice, as I gave an example of beef earlier. And then there's the why reinvent the wheel. Why suggest we'll do something about chocolate when you've already got fair trade? And this is the civil society element. This is because my network, if I'm a card-carrying member of the Women's Institute or a church group, who do I believe? Do I believe a new label put forward by the retailer or manufacturer, or do I believe the fair trade one, which has got a lot of buy-in by civil society organisations? So you're not going to argue with that. So you accept that there are some things out there. But what's happening is that corporations are now, and this came very clearly at our interviews the last couple of years, are leading their own supply chain initiatives sustainably. And there are good examples out here. They're the market innovators who are embedding sustainability. The two main ones actually in the retail have been Marks and Spencer's with their Plan A and Unilever in manufacturing. But Unilever, if you look at Unilever's Sustainable Living Plan, and they shrunk their range of products, So a lot of it's about palm oil, things which are ubiquitous in their products. Soya, there's a lot of that because they're a manufacturer and it occurs all over the place. And then it's, healthcare products, which is where they're focusing their brands on. So, they instigated the Marine Stewardship Council, But that's when they had the Bird's Eye brand, which they no longer have. So they left their mark there, I guess. But what we see Sainsbury's coming out with the 2020 sustainability plan. Kraft have come up with one. In Kraft's case, I suspect they're so anxious about the health issues that they're too keen to focus on environmental sustainability, although health can be part of sustainability, of course. Anyway, the point is that there's what's happened in the last few years, probably 5 years from Marks and Spencer's taking the lead in Unilever, I would say. You've had this establishment of the large corporations setting up their own sustainable supply chains, not relying just on certification. Certification schemes have their place, but they're digging much deeper into their supply chains than that. What you get from this, obviously, are practices of information editing for the market. So they've been translated by the supply chain as well as the certification schemes. And what information editing allows is for stakeholders to develop coherent signal narratives about food products. And they decide how much information they want to convey. Often they're reactive to how food issues are being discussed. So if issues come to the fore in broader society, like chicken welfare, free-range eggs become the offer. And we've seen very successful campaigns in the UK on this, and around fish as well, by our celebrity chefs and so forth. In this one, this is the notion that it's about putting a simple label which gives reassurance. This is from an assurance scheme. The level of reassurance that someone is looking after stuff on their behalf, and they can feed it to their children. Retail's view, it's a long quote, but essentially what it's saying, you pick the things you want to say. This is quite interesting actually, because it takes us into the sorts of things increasingly being sold in supermarkets, such as complex meals and so forth. You might pick out your key questions. So first of all, I have to tell them about the nutrient contents, I have to do that legally by law. Second, about the packaging. So it's recyclable. You've got your indicators on your packaging when you open it and throw it away. You might tell me about the Amazon, but I'm stuck with the packaging, need not to do. And then you might be left with some space to tell where the product came from, the sourcing story. So if I've got a ready meal, which is a complex issue, lots of things in it, what story do you tell? How do you edit that information? What he's saying here, I could tell you about the spuds and the fish and the potatoes, but I will probably tell you about the fish story, or free-range eggs in a quiche. So we'll pick the most relevant story, but not all of it. So we've got this continual translation in the marketplace, this editing going on. Information editing then clearly leads to choice editing. So it's how, from our view of looking at it from the transparency window, what you're getting then in the bigger sort of governance picture is this choice editing taking place in the way that the information is edited. And a grocery retailer is saying that. Again, a similar quote to the one before, but from a different retailer, saying that we only use free-range eggs, so in a way you don't need a label on the product because our brand promises that all are free-range eggs. So it's also about the branding of the company itself. And Unilever will tell you that. Unilever are out at the front of environmental sustainability in a very sort of high-profile way because they want that to be axiomatic to their brand identity. They want the consumer or whoever's dealing with Unilever products to automatically assume that they do the right thing. And they're very clear about that. This is just something else that came out of this work, which I mentioned. There's a tendency to talk about business to business and business to consumer, B2B, B2C. What this tells us, if you look at the supply chain more carefully, is you've got to look at business to consumer relationships. It's not just B2C or B2B, it's B2B to C is the dynamic you've got to capture, and I don't think that's captured in that marketing literature. The other thing which came out of it, which actually came from some of the expert retail people who were involved in the project on the expert forum, was the emphasis on consumer to consumer, C to C. They're very aware of this. And if you look at Marks and Spencer's Plan A review, which came out this summer, a 5-year review of their Plan A, one of the first things they say is the importance of doing the right thing because of consumer to consumer social network communication. So there's a sort of broader issue here, which reminds us again that civil society has an important role to play. In terms of this conceptualizes the findings in a way that is constrained by my PowerPoint inabilities. So that's one of the PowerPoint diagrams I can do. So it may be that there's a better way of doing this if I had better skills. But essentially, we're talking obviously about commercial reasons for food integrity or sustainability initiatives. It makes sense commercially. It makes sense on the supply chain because you can't get the goods if they're not going to be there in the future. If you run out of palm oil, of tuna, you're not going to be able to. You're not going to be able to get them. And reputation. It's about brand reputation. But they overlap. The point is that they overlap in different ways. You have to look very carefully at this. And the commerciality, obviously, you will be out of business unless your supply chain is sustainable, is the thinking increasingly. But commerciality is also about giving your customers what they want and telling the right story, which relates to your reputation, your CSR, and so forth. Right, finally, I've actually run out of time, but I just quickly want to summarize the last few slides. This is what's happening about policy movement. There's policy movement, interestingly, about methodologies for sustainable food taking place, and also about using the current market translations to convey advice to consumers to consume sustainably on food. And the Commission is collaborating with industry around a convergence of methodologies, which is around life cycle assessments and how to use them. And we're also beginning to see this occurring more at a global level as well. So this is an area where we're currently doing work. This is just an example of food consumption production advice, which I've used in another article and talks. But these are just ones across Europe. Germany has an annual, since 2008, shopping basket advice, which includes labels and schemes in it. So they say, this is what you should buy if you want a sustainable shopping basket, and they update that every year. The Dutch, actually got Holland and Netherlands. The trouble is, Netherlands doesn't fit in that box. The S goes over the end, but that's another fine. So Netherlands, Holland, they've done a couple. This was an initiative in 2008 around a policy outline for achieving sustainable food. It's very much around consumer education campaigns as being part of that, as well as sustainable food production. Sweden came up with environmentally friendly food choices, which they notified the EU and wanted to become a technical standard, but it was rejected. There's a range, it's going on a lot of different places in a lot of different ways. This also feeds into how the European Commission is now looking at the methodologies of sustainable food. So it's a bit small. Essentially, they've had a sustainable consumption production action plan in 2008, very little about food in there. They looked at the eco-label, the eco-label, the sort of Blue Angel, which came from Germany originally, which you put on electronic products. If they're energy efficient, they get the standard label. They've looked at that at doing it to food and rejected it. And the reason they rejected it is because the methodologies aren't robust enough, which I agree with, actually. And it was one of the findings of our Transparent Food project. Industry with DG Environment has set up the European Sustainable Consumption Production Roundtable, and they are trying to facilitate agreement on environmental assessment methodologies and environmental information and products via voluntary communication to consumers. And this is supported by the Joint Research Centre, the Institute for Environmental Sustainability. So this is a research body of the EU, feeding into DG Environment, but with all the big trade associations from Europe related to the food industry involved. So that's a very EU type approach to roundtable policy making. Also, DG Environment are trying to come up with a harmonised framework methodology on their own for the calculation of the environmental footprint of products, which at a meeting I was at DEFRA a year ago had the FDF in a complete panic because they're very much entrenched on this one and they want to know what's going on with this one. The second one, however, is the same group of researchers involved from the Commission, so one assumes that they will be dovetailed. And then finally we have the Roadmap to Resource Efficient Europe, which is part of the overall strategy of the European Union, led by the Commission, towards Europe 2020, a strategy for smart, sustainable and inclusive growth. There we are, you couldn't have much more all-embracing than that. But within that there are key policy milestones to be achieved: 20% reduction in the food chain's resource inputs, so resource efficiency. Develop a methodology for sustainable criteria for food commodities by 2014. And out of that, DG Environment are negotiating, are doing roundtable discussions around the sustainable food communication. What is sustainable food? So there are new players joining the journey down the end of the road to sustainability. This is collaborative government of the global supply chain. We're also seeing at the global level a greater awareness. It's a commercial interpretation of resource depletion and constraint, leading to a vision around resource efficiencies. It's their vision of the problem that they've got with their supply chains. They're not going to be out of business if they don't do something. And this is occurring at a more global level. And as I say, what interests me here is where are the competitive and non-competitive boundaries? How much is shared? How is this decided, negotiated by who? This quote is actually from the Product Sustainability Forum set up under RAP. Just at the end, on a question and answer, they say that they are collaborating with similar initiatives around the globe. And it's quite telling, really, that there's a lot going on elsewhere. The Sustainability Consortium, the European Food Sustainable Consumption Production Roundtable, published over the last slide, so on and so forth. The French government's Grenelle initiative around environmental labelling products. The Sustainability Consortium was set up essentially with money from Walmart. It's a big American initiative based, university-based, but you have to pay to become a member. Fortunately, one of the research projects I'm in, one of our partners, a research institute in Sweden, is a member because they decided they better join just in case they couldn't get the information they need. So the privatisation of knowledge plays its way out. I think these are just some conclusions from what I've said. We've got state-led strategies, public-private sector collaborations over sustainable food. This leads to private sector collaborations as well. Policy improvisation is something that I convinced, the reality in life is it's not planned, it's improvised. You come up with a strategy and then you have to improvise how to do it. I'm actually chair of our university sustainability committee at City University, so I'm aware of how that works firsthand. Individual corporate-led sustainable supply chain strategies are emerging, and moves now to stipulate the methodologies. And in all this, we're moving between multi-level policy arenas. So that's pretty much it. I just should point out that in Sense, we are currently on a 3-year project harmonising environmental sustainability in the European food and drink chain. Sense Project EU, if you want to have a look at that. That is doing work very similar to the European Consumption Roundtable as well. So it might be worth having a look at that. There's a nice little cartoon animation they've done about the project, which you will find is again another thing that's emerging in all sorts of. I've seen 3 or 4 almost identical, but we've done one, which tells you nice about the project. And currently, myself and a researcher, we've got to do this by the end of the year, are looking at social life cycle assessment on products, which is a derivation of environmental life cycle assessment, and it's something which quite a lot's been written about in the last 5 years amongst a very small group of researchers, and we've done a pretty comprehensive literature review of it. And it's a classic example of boundary setting, of how do you solve the problems, of trying to come up with a methodology which actually misses loads. And therefore, because you can't get the data, you can find it to certain things. But we're in the middle of doing that, so it's too early to come to conclusions, but that's the